Hello there. Tonight, we are going to drift back in time to a hospital, quiet but determined, where one surgeon decided to test the limits of medicine, and to do so, he would call on his most trusted assistant. Before you get too comfortable, let me gently ask, if you enjoy these stories, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and perhaps leave a small comment telling me where you are tuning in from tonight. It's always wonderful to know who is listening and from which corners of the world. Now, let's begin. It was a grey winter morning in the year 1900 and something, a time when surgery was still more art than science. The hospital rose above the city streets like a stone sentinel, its windows clouded with frost. Outside, the world moved slowly, the clatter of a horse cart delivering milk, the hiss of steam from an early tram rolling along the tracks, the muffled chatter of street vendors opening their stalls. Inside, the air was different. It smelled sharply of carbolic acid, the antiseptic favored in those years, mixed faintly with the iron tang of sterilized instruments. Floors were polished wood, creaking under the soft steps of nurses in long uniforms. Corridors were lit by a mixture of daylight filtering through tall glass panes and the yellow glow of gas lamps. And in one of those quiet surgical wings behind a heavy oak door stood a man we will call the surgeon. He was not yet famous, though his colleagues spoke of him with a mix of admiration and caution. His shoulders were narrow, his coat a little too large, but his gaze was steady. He moved slowly, with the deliberation of someone who had learned that in surgery, patience often meant survival. At his side almost always was the assistant. You might imagine them carrying a tray of instruments, forceps that clicked gently when touched, scalpels that caught the faint light, glass syringes that looked fragile yet precise. The assistant followed without complaint, eyes alert, hands steady, always ready. The bond between them was unusual. It went beyond the normal relation of master and pupil. In those days, few would dare to share such dangerous responsibilities. Yet here they were, bound by trust that would one day lead them into the most extraordinary experiment of their time. But before we arrive there, let us linger in this moment, in the hallways of a hospital on a winter morning, in the world of medicine as it once was, where the rhythm of healing was slower, quieter, and yet filled with daring possibilities. Now, before we focus too closely on our surgeon and his assistant, let us pause and wander for a while through the wider world of medicine in those years. Because to understand their experiment, we need to first imagine the atmosphere of hospitals at the turn of the century. Picture a long corridor, its walls painted in muted cream tones. The air carried a lingering mixture of soap, coal smoke from the boilers, and the faintest scent of ether, the anesthetic that had only recently become common. At the far end of the hall, a set of double doors led into the operating theatre. Above them, a round clock ticked softly, marking the slow passage of time. The surgical tools of the day were simple but unforgiving. Scalpels with slender steel blades, forceps polished to a mirror shine, needles held in little cloth pouches. Sterilization was still being perfected. Instruments were boiled in large vats of water or held over flame, sometimes dipped in strong-smelling carbolic acid. The hiss of steam sterilizers was a familiar sound in many surgical wings. The theater itself was designed less for comfort and more for observation. Wooden benches rose in a semicircle, allowing students and physicians to watch operations as if attending a lecture. Light poured down from tall windows, or on darker days from overhead gas lamps, their flames flickering against the white tiles. The walls echoed faintly with footsteps and the scrape of metal on enamel trays. Uniforms were stark and practical. Surgeons wore stiff white coats, their sleeves rolled carefully back. Nurses moved quietly in long dresses, aprons tied neatly, their starched caps framing tired but determined faces. There were no disposable gloves as we know them today. Many operations were performed with bare hands, scrubbed red from repeated washing in cold water and harsh soaps. And what did medical journals speak of in those years? They were filled with cautious optimism. Articles debated the possibility of organ transplantation, but most writers dismissed it as fantasy. The human heart, especially, was considered untouchable, a sacred engine of life that once failed could never be restarted. Some journals printed accounts of daring experiments on animals, dogs, cats, rabbits, but almost always the result was the same: failure within hours. Still, there was curiosity everywhere. In Paris, in Vienna, in London, physicians were exploring new techniques: better anesthesia, faster suturing, more reliable antiseptics. In America, surgeons were beginning to specialize, forming early professional societies, publishing case reports. Letters crossed oceans slowly, carrying news of new instruments or accounts of rare survival. A typical hospital day began at sunrise. The night staff would hand over their reports, which patients had slept, who had struggled through fever, whose pulse had weakened in the dark hours. Breakfast carts rattled through the wards, bowls of broth, crusts of bread, weak tea. Doctors made their rounds, moving from bed to bed, often trailed by a cluster of students clutching notebooks. Orders were given in low voices: more morphine here, another bandage there. Surgery, in those days, was scheduled for the brighter hours of the morning. Light was precious, and without it, precision was impossible. Patients were wheeled into the theater on narrow gurneys, covered with heavy wool blankets. The sound of wheels across wooden floors was a familiar, almost mournful sound. And so the rhythm continued: operations in the morning, recovery and observation in the afternoon, endless note-taking into the evening. By nightfall, the hospital grew quieter. Lamps glowed dimly in the corridors, the scent of disinfectant clung to the air, and the steady tick of clocks filled the silence. Elsewhere in the world, other surgeons were chasing the same dream. Some experimented with kidney grafts, stitching small pieces of tissue from one animal to another. Others tried bone transplants, setting fractured limbs with borrowed pieces. Each case was studied, debated, dissected in the journals of the time. Successes were rare, failures common, yet each attempt added another thread to the tapestry of medical progress. Now imagine yourself, if you will, seated quietly in one of those observation benches. Around you, the theater is hushed. Below, a surgeon leans over his patient, his coat bright under the lamps. Instruments gleam on a tray beside him. Nurses stand ready, their faces calm, their hands folded in anticipation. There is no hum of modern machines, no steady beep of monitors. Only the surgeon's voice, low and deliberate, and the quiet breath of the patient lying beneath the cloth. This was the world in which our surgeon lived. A world both limited and limitless. Limited in its tools, its understanding of the body, yet limitless in its curiosity, its courage, its belief that perhaps tomorrow the impossible might become possible. And within this world, our surgeon walked each day carrying not just scalpels and notes, but a vision that perhaps one day even the heart itself could be transplanted. To understand the surgeon who would one day test the limits of the human heart, we must step back further still, back to his earliest years. Imagine a quiet town, perhaps on the edge of the countryside, where mornings began with the sound of roosters and the steady clip of horses' hooves on cobblestones. The boy who would grow into our surgeon spent his days in a modest home with tall windows and shelves lined with well-worn books. His father, a reserved man, valued discipline. His mother, gentle, encouraged curiosity. From the start, he showed a fascination with the hidden structures of life. While other children collected marbles or painted wooden toys, he collected feathers, bones, and pressed flowers, curious about their shapes and patterns. In the dim light of his family's study, he would open old anatomy texts, tracing with his finger the engraved drawings of muscles and veins. The smell of ink and aged paper became as familiar to him as the scent of bread in the kitchen. Schooling came with its own rhythms. Classrooms with chalk-dusted air, the scratching of quills across parchment, teachers in long coats speaking of mathematics, of Latin, of natural philosophy. Yet what captured him most were the lessons in natural science. A frog's dissection, carefully performed, would leave him awake at night, staring at the ceiling, marveling at the quiet machinery hidden inside living creatures. As he grew older, the idea of medicine took hold. To study the body was one thing, to heal it was another. He gained entrance to a medical school of some reputation, a sprawling stone building where lecture halls smelled of wax candles and ink, and where the echo of footsteps on marble floors carried a solemn weight. In those years, medical students were taught not just through books but through endless observation. He would sit in crowded theaters, coat buttoned tightly against the cold, watching professors demonstrate surgeries with steady hands. The air in those rooms was heavy, a mix of carbolic acid, sweat, and the faint hum of nervous students. He filled notebook after notebook, his handwriting precise, his attention rarely wavering. Mentors shaped him. One, an older surgeon with a kind face, encouraged him to think beyond the rules printed in journals. Medicine, the mentor would say, is built not just on what we know, but on what we dare to try. Another, sterner, taught discipline, every instrument polished, every note recorded, every incision measured with care. Between them, the young man learned both daring and restraint. His first encounters with real surgery were overwhelming. The flicker of gas lamps, the sight of patients lying pale beneath cloths, the tension of silence broken only by the clink of instruments. His hands trembled at first, as all young surgeons' hands do, but with each passing month, steadiness grew. Nurses began to notice that when he stood at the table, his gaze did not waver, his motions did not falter. He performed his early surgeries with quiet determination. Appendectomies, wound repairs, the setting of fractured bones. Each successful procedure added to his reputation. Other students sought his advice. Professors allowed him small responsibilities. He did not rush. He knew that greatness in medicine was not found in quick results but in careful steps, patiently built over years. And yet, beneath this calm exterior, a restless spirit stirred. He was not content with routine healing. He read of surgeons abroad, men attempting experimental grafts, new methods of suturing, bold ideas about replacing entire organs. Late at night, he would linger in the medical library, candle burning low, reading until his eyes grew heavy. His notes were filled not just with recorded facts, but with questions. Always questions. What made a body reject a graft? What if the heart, that most sacred organ, could be replaced? And if it could, who would dare attempt it? It was this mindset, a mixture of discipline, patience, and daring, that would one day guide him into uncharted territory, a mindset that would bring him to the assistant and to an experiment few could imagine. But before we reach that moment, we must meet the other half of this story, the assistant. For no surgeon works alone, and without the loyalty of this quiet companion, history might have turned out very differently. Every remarkable surgeon has a shadow, someone who follows close behind, ready with a cloth, a word, or a glance. For our surgeon, that person was the assistant. The assistant was not the sort of figure who drew attention. Their presence was quiet, but constant, like the low ticking of a clock in a room. Medium in height, always neatly dressed in hospital whites, their hands bore faint stains of ink from endless note-taking, and sometimes the faint smell of soap from hours of scrubbing instruments. They had a voice that rarely rose above a murmur, yet when instructions were given in the operating theatre, those words carried with unmistakable clarity. Nurses trusted them, students respected them, and the surgeon relied on them more than he ever said aloud. How did they come to meet? The stories differ, but one can imagine it was in those dim corridors of the medical school hospital where eager students lingered, hoping to be noticed. The surgeon saw in the assistant not only intelligence but steadiness, a calmness under pressure, a willingness to learn, and perhaps a quiet courage that others lacked. From that moment on, their paths intertwined. The assistant's days were filled with the countless small duties that sustain great experiments. At dawn, when frost still clung to the glass windows, they would arrive with their notes tucked under one arm, ready to prepare the day's instruments. Each scalpel was wiped until the steel gleamed, each needle threaded and set in careful rows. Syringes made of glass and metal were inspected for cracks, boiled in sterilizing vats, and laid out to cool. There were journals to be read, articles clipped and annotated in neat handwriting, margins filled with questions and comparisons. Late at night, when most of the hospital had gone quiet, one might find the assistant hunched over a wooden desk, copying notes by the flicker of a lamp, a pot of black coffee cooling at their side. But their duties were not only technical, they brought a human steadiness to the surgeon's work. When patients whispered anxiously before being wheeled into the theatre, it was often the assistant's hand that reassured them, resting lightly on a shoulder. When experiments failed and the surgeon grew silent, it was the assistant who quietly tidied the instruments, brewed tea, and left a notebook open to a fresh page, a small, unspoken invitation to try again tomorrow. Their loyalty was not the kind born of obligation. It was deeper, forged through years of standing together at the table, of shared glances in the tense silence of operations, of long nights when the only sounds were the scratch of pens, the hiss of boiling water and the sigh of winter wind against the window panes. In time, the surgeon trusted this assistant with tasks that others would have refused, recording precise timings during experimental procedures, handling delicate tissue with steady hands, even carrying secrets that could not be spoken aloud in faculty meetings or published in journals. And perhaps most extraordinary of all, the assistant never stepped away. Where others might have said, "This is too dangerous, too strange," the assistant stayed. They understood, in a way, the restless drive of the surgeon, that need to push just one step further than anyone else dared. It is no exaggeration to say that without the assistant, the surgeon's work would have faltered, for it was the assistant who prepared the stage, who stood by through failure, and who, when the time came, would give more than anyone else could ever imagine. But for now, picture them simply at their desk, pen in hand, candle flickering low, their notes filling page after page. Outside, the streets of the city have gone quiet, and inside the hospital, the last footsteps fade away. Only the assistant remains, bent over their work, preparing for another day that will bring new questions, new risks, and eventually, a decision that would change the history of surgery forever. By the time our surgeon and assistant had worked together for several years, whispers of a greater challenge began to drift through the halls of medicine. The heart, the most guarded of all organs. In textbooks of the era, it was described with reverence, a pump, yes, but also a mystery. Surgeons of the 19th century had grown comfortable with bones, with limbs, even with abdominal organs. But the heart, that was another matter. To open the chest was to walk on sacred ground. Most physicians agreed. Once the heart failed, nothing more could be done. And yet, for some, that very impossibility became an invitation. The surgeon, with his steady eyes and quiet determination, began to wonder. He read reports from Europe of daring experiments, small animal studies, attempts to stitch arteries together, efforts to graft blood vessels from one creature into another. The journals were filled with failure, dogs whose pulses faltered within minutes, rabbits that awoke only to weaken before the day was done. Each account ended the same way. The subject expired. But behind those lines was progress, however faint. Sutures that held longer, anesthesia that gave more time, antiseptics that reduced infection. Each failure, to the surgeon, was not a closed door, but a small crack of light. The assistant, too, began to notice. In the evenings, over cups of strong coffee in the hospital laboratory, they would talk softly, surrounded by the faint hiss of gas lamps. The surgeon would tap the table with his finger, tracing diagrams of arteries on scrap paper. The assistant would listen, nodding slowly, adding notes in the margins. Why should the heart be untouchable? The surgeon might ask. Because it is too dangerous, the assistant would reply. And then, after a pause, but danger does not mean impossible. In those dimly lit conversations, the seeds of the experiment were planted. The obstacles were many. Sutures of the time were silk, prone to fraying, requiring endless patience. Needles were hand-forged, each slightly different, each demanding delicate handling. Anesthesia was imprecise. Ether and chloroform could quiet a patient, but too much risked death. And above all, there was rejection, though they did not yet call it that. They spoke instead of mysterious failures, when grafted tissue would blacken or vessels refused to knit together. Still the surgeon persisted. He began with animals, not for spectacle but for learning. A dog, its chest carefully opened under chloroform, its pulse measured with the ticking of a pocket watch. Instruments laid out in precise order, retractors, clamps, sutures. The assistant recorded every detail, pen scratching steadily across the page. How long the subject survived, how the stitches held, what signs appeared first when the heart began to falter. These trials rarely ended in success. Yet each one taught them something new. The assistant's notebooks filled with diagrams and annotations, the margins dense with observations. The surgeon's face, though often drawn with fatigue, carried a flicker of resolve. Together, they knew. The only way forward was not to stop. And so, in the quiet hours of the hospital, when the corridors were empty and the city outside had fallen into sleep, they continued their discussions. Could it be done? Could a human heart, failing and replaced, continue to beat? And if it could, who would dare attempt it first? It was in those late-night conversations, under the hum of lamps and the smell of boiled instruments, that the assistant made a quiet decision. If ever the surgeon was to attempt such a thing, it would not be on a stranger. It would not be on a patient pulled unwillingly into risk. It would be on someone who understood the danger, someone who trusted him completely. And who could that be, except the assistant themselves? The day itself arrived quietly, not with trumpets, not with announcements, but with the hush of a winter morning. Outside the hospital, frost clung to the window panes. The streets were muffled under a thin layer of snow. A lone carriage passed slowly, wheels crunching against ice, while chimney smoke rose in pale grey ribbons into the still air. It was the sort of morning when time seemed reluctant to move, when even the sun struggled to push its light through the clouds. Inside, the hospital stirred awake. Nurses moved softly through the wards, adjusting blankets, checking pulses, whispering encouragement to patients half asleep. The kitchens rattled with tin trays, the smell of porridge drifting faintly through the halls. But in one particular wing, behind a heavy set of oak doors, something unusual was unfolding. The assistant had risen before dawn. Their face was pale but composed, eyes steady, steps measured. They had agreed, with quiet courage, that if the surgeon was to test the limits of medicine, it would be upon them. No stranger would bear this risk. No unwitting patient would carry this burden. It would be the assistant, willing, prepared, and trusting. The surgeon, too, was calm. His coat buttoned tightly, his notes laid out in careful order, his instruments polished to a gleam. He spoke little that morning. Perhaps he feared that too many words would disturb the fragile balance of courage in the room. Preparation began in silence. The theater was scrubbed. Buckets of carbolic solution sloshed across the floor, their acrid scent filling the air. Trays of instruments were boiled and cooled, arranged with precision: scalpels, clamps, sutures, glass syringes. Each tool caught the dim light from the frosted windows, glinting faintly as if waiting to be called into action. The assistant washed their hands at the basin, water icy against the skin, scrubbing slowly, methodically, until the redness shone. They donned the stiff white gown, sleeves pulled snug, cap tied beneath the chin. Their breath came steady, visible in the cold air of the theater. The surgeon did the same. Gown, gloves, a final inspection of instruments. He checked the clock on the wall. Its ticking seemed louder than usual, each second marking the gravity of what was about to begin. The assistant lay upon the narrow surgical table, its leather surface hard beneath the wool blanket. Gas lamps flickered overhead, adding a warm glow to the otherwise cold morning light. The surgeon leaned over, speaking in a voice so low it was barely audible, a reassurance, a reminder of trust. Then came the anesthetic. Ether poured carefully onto a cloth, held gently to the assistant's face. The smell was sharp, sweet, overwhelming. Breaths grew slower, deeper, until finally the chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm of sleep. The theater grew quieter still. Only the sound of instruments being lifted, placed, adjusted. The soft murmur of nurses waiting, their eyes fixed on the surgeon, the ticking clock. And so the operation began. The incision was made with deliberate slowness, the scalpel gliding through layers of skin and muscle, each cut measured, each pause considered. Retractors were placed, gently opening the way. The chest was revealed, ribs glistening faintly under the lamplight. The surgeon's hands moved steadily, guided not only by skill but by years of preparation, by nights of study, by the trust of the one lying before him. Step by step, he worked toward the heart. That sacred organ beating faintly within its cage. A soundless rhythm, yet one that carried the weight of life itself. The instruments clinked softly as they were exchanged. Sutures were prepared, silk threads coiled neatly beside the surgeon's hand. Every motion was observed, recorded by a nurse standing quietly at the side. Time was marked in whispered notes. 15 minutes since incision, 20. The procedure unfolded like a ritual. Blood flow was clamped, vessels carefully tied. The failing tissue was removed with solemn precision, as if handling something both fragile and holy. And then, the replacement, lifted delicately into place, stitched with trembling patience, each knot tied as though sealing a prayer. There was no rushing. Each moment stretched long and deliberate, the theater suspended in stillness. The surgeon's breath steady. The assistant motionless beneath the lamps. The nurses, hands folded, waiting in reverent silence. At last, the final sutures were tied, the clamps removed. For a moment, the theater seemed to hold its breath, and then, the faintest pulse, the faintest flicker of rhythm, a beat, hesitant, then another, stronger. The surgeon closed his eyes briefly, exhaling slowly. The nurses exchanged glances, but said nothing. The operation was not over, but the heart was beating. That alone was remarkable. Closure followed, layers stitched carefully, skin drawn together, bandages wrapped snugly. Instruments were set aside, their metal dulled with condensation. The surgeon removed his gloves, his face drawn with fatigue but lit with a quiet, restrained relief. The assistant remained unconscious, their chest rising and falling under the wool blanket. The hardest part was over, but the true test was yet to come. For now came the waiting, hours, then days, where every breath, Every flicker of pulse would matter. When the last suture was tied, the last bandage laid in place, the theater did not erupt into cheers or applause. It fell silent. The surgeon stood back, shoulders slumped, hands trembling ever so slightly from the long hours of concentration. The nurses moved softly, tidying instruments, wiping tables, closing curtains. And upon the narrow surgical bed, the assistant lay still, chest rising faintly beneath the weight of wool blankets. The operation was over, but its outcome had only just begun. The assistant was wheeled into a private room near the theater, a chamber with tall windows that let in the pale winter light. The walls smelled faintly of antiseptic and soap. The wooden floor creaked beneath each footstep, and in the corner stood a tall iron stove, radiating a soft heat. A single clock ticked steadily on the mantel, its sound loud in the silence. The first hours were the hardest. Nurses checked the assistant's pulse every few minutes, counting beats with fingers pressed to the wrist, eyes narrowing in concentration. Thermometers were slid gently beneath the tongue, notes recorded in careful script. The surgeon hovered close by, pacing slowly, his coat still stained with the faint traces of the theater. Outside, the hospital continued its rhythm. Carts rattled in the wards, orderlies whispered in the corridors, bells rang faintly in the chapel down the street. But inside this room, time seemed to stop. Each breath of the assistant, each flicker of heartbeat beneath the bandages carried enormous weight. At night, the atmosphere deepened. Lamps burned low, their yellow light casting long shadows against the plaster walls. Nurses dozed quietly in wooden chairs, jerking awake whenever the clock struck the hour. The surgeon himself rarely slept. He sat at the bedside, chin resting on his hand, eyes fixed on the slow rise and fall of the assistant's chest. Days passed in this strange half-world of waiting. There were signs of weakness, fevers, shallow breaths, moments when the pulse faltered. Yet somehow, each time, the assistant endured. Tea was brewed in small pots, broth spooned gently between lips, hands wiped with warm cloths. Each small act of care felt monumental. News began to spread, slowly at first. A colleague overheard whispers, a nurse confided in another ward. Letters were written, sealed in wax, and sent across the city. The surgeon has done it. The assistant lives. Some dismissed it immediately. Impossible, surely a rumor. Others leaned forward, curious, daring to believe. Medical journals debated quietly. Editors received notes, but hesitated to print them, fearing ridicule. Yet the story grew. In cafes near the hospital, men in stiff collars discussed it over black coffee. In lecture halls, professors spoke cautiously, hinting at unconfirmed reports. Meanwhile, in the room itself, life went on at a slower pace. The assistant regained consciousness, eyes flickering open, lips dry, breath unsteady. The surgeon was there immediately, leaning close, whispering reassurance. Their gaze met, patient and surgeon, but more than that, two companions bound by an extraordinary secret. Recovery stretched into weeks. Bandages were changed, stitches inspected, notes recorded in precise detail. The assistant grew stronger, step by step, their face regaining color, their voice returning. Each milestone, sitting upright, walking a few paces, sipping broth without aid, was met with quiet relief. The hospital itself seemed to hold its breath. Staff moved with greater care in that wing. Visitors paused outside the door, listening for sounds of life. Even the clocks seemed louder, as if marking the passage of history. Beyond those walls, debates grew fiercer. Could such a thing truly have been done? Was it science or recklessness? Letters arrived from abroad, some congratulatory, others condemning. "You have crossed a boundary that should never be crossed," one critic wrote. Another declared, "If this is true, it changes everything." But inside the quiet room, none of that mattered. What mattered was the steady rhythm of recovery, the assistant's hand warm in the surgeon's, the quiet crackle of the stove in the corner, the snow falling softly outside the frosted windows. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, a new reality took root. What had been unthinkable was now perhaps possible. The heart could be touched, replaced, and live on. In the years that followed, the memory of that winter operation lingered like a faint echo. For those who were there, it was unforgettable. The quiet theater, the ticking clock, the assistant's courage. For those who only heard of it in whispers, it became almost a legend. The surgeon continued his work, though never quite the same as before. His colleagues regarded him with a mixture of respect and unease. Some admired his boldness, calling him a pioneer. Others criticized him harshly, accusing him of recklessness, of stepping beyond the boundaries of medicine. Yet even his harshest critics could not ignore the results. Medical journals, once skeptical, began to change their tone. Articles appeared discussing experimental cardiac procedures. Conferences included quiet sessions on transplantation, once dismissed entirely as fantasy. What had been unthinkable was now at least discussable. That alone was progress. The assistant, meanwhile, carried their own legacy, not in books or speeches, but in the quiet continuation of life itself. Their recovery became living proof that the surgeon's daring had not been in vain. They returned slowly to their duties, though never with quite the same anonymity as before. Students whispered when they entered the room, "That is the one who lived through the operation." Nurses exchanged glances, half in awe, half in disbelief, and yet the assistant remained humble. They carried on as before, preparing instruments, keeping notes, brewing late-night coffee. To them, the act had not been about fame, but about trust, about loyalty to the surgeon and to the work they shared. Together, surgeon and assistant continued their research, not always successfully, for transplantation was still a science decades ahead of its time. But their courage planted seeds. Younger surgeons watched, listened, and carried the ideas forward. Across the world, in cities and hospitals far away, others began their own attempts, slowly, cautiously, but no longer dismissing the possibility. Time moved on. The hospital changed. Gas lamps gave way to electric bulbs, their glow brighter, steadier. Instruments improved, sutures became finer, anesthesia safer. New generations of doctors filled the lecture halls, studying diagrams of procedures that once would have been considered madness. By the mid-20th century, the dream of heart transplantation had become reality in earnest. Surgeons performed operations that saved thousands of lives. Techniques were refined, survival rates improved, and what began as a whisper of impossibility grew into a routine, life-saving procedure. Each of those milestones, each of those successful patients, carried within them a faint trace of that winter morning when one surgeon and one assistant dared to attempt the unthinkable. As for their personal legacy, it was quieter. Neither sought celebrity. The surgeon published sparingly, preferring practice to publicity. The assistant left no grand memoirs, no interviews. What they shared was something more subtle. A story passed quietly through hospital halls from one generation of students to another. And perhaps that is fitting, because their legacy was not in the glory of names, but in the steady beat of hearts that continued on, hearts that lived because they had once dared to believe it was possible. Today, when modern surgeons perform heart transplants under gleaming lights, with advanced machines humming and monitors beeping steadily, few pause to think of that dimly lit theater with its gas lamps and frosted windows. But in a way, each of those modern procedures carries a thread back to that time, to the surgeon who believed, to the assistant who trusted, to a quiet morning when history shifted, almost unnoticed. And so our story comes to rest. We began on a winter morning, in a hospital filled with the sharp scent of antiseptic and the soft ticking of clocks. We followed a surgeon who dreamed of possibilities, and an assistant who trusted enough to take the greatest risk of all. Together they stepped into the unknown, and in doing so, they opened a path that would one day save countless lives. But tonight, you don't need to think of operating theaters or journals or debates. Tonight, you can simply imagine the quiet after it all. The lamps turned low, casting a warm glow against white walls. The corridors empty, footsteps long faded. Outside, snow drifts gently past the windows, each flake silent, soft, unhurried. Inside, the steady rhythm of a heart carries on, calm, measured, reassuring. Breathe with that rhythm now, slow, steady, unbroken. A gentle beat in the quiet of the night. The surgeon rests at his desk, head bowed over notes, the assistant asleep in the next room, wrapped in blankets. The hospital itself seems to sleep, its walls holding the memory of what has passed, its windows reflecting the faint shimmer of moonlight on snow. And as you drift deeper, you might picture yourself walking those halls. Wooden floors creaking softly beneath your steps. The air cool but safe, filled with the faintest scent of soap and warmth. Each door you pass is quiet, each room hushed. At last you find a chair by the stove, its fire glowing softly, its warmth reaching out. You sit, you close your eyes, and you rest. The world of the surgeon and his assistant fades gently into history, but the comfort remains, the quiet hum of a hospital at night, the falling snow, the steady, reassuring pulse of life continuing. So now, let the story settle. Let the rhythm of your own breath carry you further. Slowly, gently, into sleep. Good night, and thank you for listening.